Human history often seems like a catalogue of disaster and tragedy, and perhaps it says something about mankind that this list could have easily had hundreds of entries. Whether as a result of disease, war, famine, or a combination of the three, there have been multiple times throughout history that must have been sheer hell to live through. Here are my choices for 5 of the worst times to be alive. Number 5. Europe during the Black Death. Life in medieval Europe was already a backbreaking, brutal, and often short existence. However, the arrival of 12 Genoese merchant ships in October of 1347 brought with them microscopic passengers that would unleash a reign of death and terror that would wipe out as much as 60% of Europe's population. Widely regarded as one of the most devastating outbreaks in human history, the pandemic that would become known as the Black Death would leave as many as 200 million people dead across Europe and Asia before it finally subsided, reducing the world's population by up to 22%. Such numbers of deaths are difficult to comprehend, yet the death toll was so high that it's as if a nuclear war was unleashed upon the medieval world, with so many lost that it would take over 300 years for the world's population to reach its pre-plague level. The tiny bacterium responsible for so much human misery thrived in the unsanitary and densely populated towns and cities of Europe. In some cases, as many as 80% of the population would perish, with many smaller settlements left permanently abandoned, their former inhabitants dead or fleeing in terror. The appearance of boils oozing blood and pus in the groin, armpits, or neck would for many be the first sign that they were condemned to a painful and unavoidable death. The boils would often be as large as apples, and accompanied by a terrible fever and the vomiting of blood, and death was all but guaranteed to come within just 7 days of infection, although often much faster. Many chroniclers at the time wrote of how a person might go to sleep at night in perfect health, only to be dead by morning. The Black Death went hand in hand with terror, and it must have seemed as if the apocalypse had arrived, as people struggled to understand just what was causing the outbreak. The plague did not discriminate. Rich and poor, nobleman and commoner, all were struck down together. In the face of such an unknown force, many turned to the heavens in search of an answer, believing that the disease was caused by astrological forces, earthquakes, or even as divine punishment from God for the sins of man. Gripped by fear, many took to the streets to engage in public displays of penance in an effort to win forgiveness from God, and the sight of processions of flagellants travelling from town to town as they beat themselves bloody became common. However, their suffering would prove to be in vain, and the plague continued to ravage their world. Panic was rife as the healthy did everything in their power to avoid the infected. Doctors refused to treat their patients, priests ignored the cries of the dying, and parents even abandoned their sick children. Hell on earth had truly arrived, and all around were bodies piled high in the streets or buried in great pits, the sick often abandoned and sealed up in their homes. Fields were left unploughed, crops unharvested, and animals untended as there was nobody left alive or willing to do the work. After all, why work today when tomorrow you might be dead? People became ever more distrustful of each other, as you never know who might be infected, and waking up each morning would have involved the terrifying routine of checking yourself for the lumps and boils that might signal that you too were soon to join the ever-growing ranks of the dead. Number 4. China during the Mongol invasion. The Chinese had long interfered in the affairs of the Mongolian tribes, encouraging rivalries and warfare between the tribes in an attempt to keep them divided and weak. Such interference was not forgotten by Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan after uniting all of the Mongol tribes under his sole leadership, and it was the ordinary people of China who would pay the price when in 1205 the Mongol invasion commenced, a conquest which was begun by the Great Khan, continued by his son Ogadai, and completed by his grandson Kublai. 3 generations of the same family would conduct a 74-year-long campaign that was unbelievable in its brutality and scale, reducing countless cities to rubble, bringing down ancient empires that were thought to be invincible, and sending millions of innocent people to an early grave. By the time the dust had settled, China was completely conquered, ruled by a foreign emperor for the first time in its history. Estimates regarding just how many people were erased from history by this invasion vary wildly. However, a census conducted a few years after the conquest showed that the population had been cut in half, from 120 million people before the invasion to just 60 million after. While this may have not been completely accurate, it points to the likelihood that tens of millions of lives were snuffed out, either killed directly by the Mongols or dying as a result of the subsequent famines caused by the chaos they unleashed. Being a Chinese citizen during this period would have been a terrifying and extremely dangerous existence. Although the entirety of China would suffer, it was northwest China that would bear the brunt of the Mongol fury. Prior to the invasion, the region was a center of wealth and innovation. However, a poorly judged decision by its rulers would lead to the area becoming largely depopulated, its cities ruined and abandoned, its people dead or fleeing south. The area had been violently subjugated as a vassal of the Great Khan. However, when the Mongols rode east against the Khwarezmid Empire 9 years later, they called upon their Chinese vassals for aid, a request that was foolishly denied. The Khan swore vengeance against the northwestern Chinese state, and after annihilating the Khwarezmid Empire, returned to northwest China to exact revenge. No mercy would be shown, and the Mongol armies methodically moved from city to city, slaughtering everyone and leaving the once great settlements that dotted the landscape in ruins, never to be inhabited again. Such was the devastation that Chinese sources claim that less than 1% of the population survived the carnage in the northwest. As the invasion moved south, fear spread amongst the people like a plague. News of Mongols on the horizon would spread panic and terror, as the people were well aware of the fate that would await them should they resist, and many cities would throw open their gates and surrender without a fight. Submitting to the Khan might earn you mercy, however resistance would be punished with massive destruction and death. Their tactics included burning farmland to starve out the population who were resisting, diverting rivers into cities to flood defenders out, and even catapulting diseased corpses over city walls to infect the population inside, a practice which some have suggested may have brought the Black Death to Europe during the later siege of the Genoese city of Kaffa. Yet the vital decision on whether to surrender would have been out of the hands of the common man on the street, and should your rulers choose to resist, you might have found yourself one of the countless millions who were corralled like animals through their city's gates before being decapitated one by one in an almost industrial manner, your head neatly stacked into a grotesque pyramid alongside everyone you had ever known. Number 3. The Americas during colonization. Exactly how many people were living in the Americas prior to the voyage of Columbus in 1492 is difficult to estimate, with numbers varying from 10 million all the way up to 100 million. Yet what is known is that contact with European settlers brought about a massive population decline that would destroy entire tribes, societies, and cultures, leaving much of the continent resembling a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Before Europeans arrived, the Americas had been isolated from the rest of the world, and as such the people living there had never been exposed to diseases which were now common in the Old World, meaning that they had not built up the same level of resistances that Europeans had, nor had they adequate medicines to treat them. The results were devastating, and shortly after contact was made with European settlers, epidemics of diseases such as smallpox spread across the continent like wildfire, killing staggering numbers of people. These losses destroyed entire communities, as there were now far fewer people left alive to hunt and plant crops, or care for the sick and dying. A tribe's food supply would have been diminished, further weakening its people and rendering them even more vulnerable to the next outbreak of disease. With so few people left alive to perform crucial tasks, established society fell apart, and those who did survive would have witnessed their entire world collapsing as friends and family died horrible deaths, and their very way of life was slowly destroyed. As the diseases raced across the land, the European settlers moving inland would have likely only been encountering the scattered bands of traumatized survivors who had somehow made it through this biological apocalypse, now left weakened and ripe for conquest. It's thought that some tribes lost over 50% of their people to disease, while smaller tribes were often wiped out entirely. Some estimates even suggest that up to 90% of the Native American population died as a result of diseases in the century following the arrival of Europeans. Such numbers would make these epidemics far more deadly than the Black Death which had ravaged Europe just a couple of centuries before, leading it to be described as the greatest catastrophe in human history. Yet, as if deadly diseases were not bad enough, many natives also had to contend with brutal wars and a miserable life of slavery should they be taken captive. up against invaders with more advanced weaponry who were better supplied and able to fight all year round. Battles routinely descended into massacres as tribes were driven off land they had lived on for centuries, while others were forced into the mines to enrich the very people who had brought about the calamity. Number 2. China during the Great Leap Forward. In the late 1950s, China's leader Chairman Mao undertook an economic and social plan which was intended to bring about rapid modernization. However, instead of turning the country into a modern paradise, the plan instead transformed China into a catastrophic nightmare that would claim the lives of up to 55 million people in just 4 years. He decided that in order for the country to transform from a farming economy to an industrial one, private ownership would need to be abolished, and by the end of 1958, 25,000 communes had been set up, each containing an average of 5,000 families. In the communes, hundreds of millions of people were forced to produce grain, which could be exported in exchange for hard currency, the people no longer working for wages, as money had instead been replaced by a system of work points. Everything was now owned by the commune, and every aspect of the individual's life was controlled by the commune they were a part of. Ancient customs such as funerals, festivals, and weddings were deemed to be counter-revolutionary and banned, instead replaced with versions deemed acceptable by the Communist Party, and even the idea of personal liberty became a faint memory. The results proved to be disastrous. Millions of skilled farmers were moved from agricultural to industrial work, leading to much of the harvest being left to rot in some areas, as there were simply not enough people left to collect it. Natural disasters such as flooding and a devastating locust swarm compounded the problem, leading to a mass famine which would cause millions to starve to death. In a sickening irony, the locust swarm was actually caused by Mao's policy, as sparrows had been killed off after being classified as pests due to their tendency to eat grain seeds. However, the sparrows were also natural predators of locusts, and with the sparrow population now decimated, there was nothing left to keep locust numbers in check. Starving, exhausted workers were forced with threats of violence to literally work themselves to death in the fields, and anyone caught growing food for themselves would be executed. Terrified commune leaders would over-report their production numbers, meaning they were forced to hand over ever greater amounts of food while their people starved, and simply reporting the real harvest numbers could lead to execution. Those deemed too old or ill to be efficient workers were banned from the commune canteens, and therefore intentionally starved to death, and even fleeing a badly hit area was not an option, as travel was forbidden. Those who failed to meet their quotas, or committed any number of acts now deemed to be a crime, were buried alive, tied up and thrown into ponds, or simply beaten to death. In fact, the murders were so numerous that it's thought that around 8% of those who died during the Great Leap Forward were violently killed, and up to 3 million people are estimated to have simply committed suicide, choosing to end their suffering rather than continue to live on in misery. As society broke down, robberies and raids on neighbouring villages became common, as people desperately sought food to survive, and reports of cannibalism became widespread. Yet Mao refused all offers of international aid, and sickeningly the country continued to be a net exporter of grain, despite the famine. The program was finally repealed in the early 1960s, and the communal system was broken up. However, Mao's insane experiment had already doomed millions to a painful and often drawn-out death. Number 1. Europe during the first half of the 20th century. The 20th century has perhaps seen the highest concentration of events that have caused unbelievable suffering and misery in all of human history. Within the space of just 30 years, 2 world wars were fought, and across the globe, genocides and mass murders have been committed in the name of political ideologies that have seen hundreds of millions perish. While any of these scenarios on their own was no doubt a nightmare to live through, there did exist a group of people who were born in just the right time and place to ensure that their lives would chart an especially unfortunate course that would see them experience all of the horrors and miseries that humans have contended with since the dawn of time, packed into just one lifetime. A man born in Europe in the closing years of the 19th century would have come of age at the beginning of the Great War, and would have no doubt been swept up in the patriotic fervour that gripped the continent, enlisting in the army to fight for his country. The First World War was the first truly modern war, during which mankind's rapidly advancing technology was deployed to deadly effect, dispensing levels of death previously unseen on the battlefield. Casualties numbering in the thousands during just one day of battle were no longer unusual, and the sight of your friends being cut to pieces by machine gun fire, blown apart by high explosive shells, choked and poisoned by deadly gases, or stabbed and beaten to death by brutal close combat weapons would have been enough to send even the most stable individual mad. Yet this procession of carnage would be repeated again and again, as wave after wave would be sent into the meat grinder, only to be beaten back again. In a war where individual battles would routinely kill hundreds of thousands, even if the young man who had enlisted in 1914 was not one of the estimated 38 million military and civilian casualties, he was still in grave danger when the war ended in 1918, which was the year that the Spanish flu pandemic began spreading across the planet. Between January 1918 and December 1920, this especially deadly and aggressive strain of flu killed up to 100 million people, which was 5% of the world's total population, which had already dipped after the slaughter of the Great War, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history, and possibly killing more than the Black Death in medieval Europe. Unusually, this strain of flu seemed to target healthy young adults, meaning veterans who had managed to survive the carnage of the First World War were especially vulnerable to its effects, hundreds of thousands of whom would die an especially nasty death as a result of pneumonia or massive hemorrhages in the lungs. Those who managed to survive these two calamities might have finally started to piece their lives back together during the 1920s, however trouble was still ahead, this time in the form of an economic crash that became known as the Great Depression, which during the 1930s would lead to incomes plummeting while unemployment skyrocketed, reaching as high as 33% in many countries, leading to nearly a decade where simply getting enough food to eat and keeping a roof over your head was a battle in itself. It could be said that the First World War and this Great Depression sowed the seeds for the most devastating conflict of all time, the Second World War, which would inflict an estimated 80 million casualties worldwide, and for perhaps millions of men would mark the second time they fought in a world war in the service of their country. It's difficult to imagine just how it would have felt to have survived these deadly events, perhaps thinking that you really had fought the war to end all wars, only to witness the world plunged into madness and slaughter for a second time, and to be called up to relive the horror all over again. Just how many men would survive the First World War, only to perish in the Second, once again experiencing the destruction technology could wreak on the battlefield, as more advanced tanks, aircrafts, and rockets were all added to the already deadly arsenals of the great powers, and would reduce much of Europe to rubble over the course of 6 bitter years of fighting, during which human decency itself seems to have broken down, as people fought with a level of brutality and cruelty that before the war might have seemed unbelievable. In fact, there was no doubt an unfortunate but sizable group of men who would experience and survive the misery of the First World War, Spanish flu, Great Depression, and Second World War, only to end their lives in a distant Siberian gulag, the suffering they had endured and even their very names, forgotten by the world they were once a part of. So those are my choices for 5 of the worst times to be alive. Let me know which times you think would have been the worst in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.